Hello. Welcome to the first panel discussion of this new series at LACMA called Racism is a Public Health Issue, conceived as a special series of focused conversations at the intersection of art and culture, equity, and the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Christine Y. Kim, and first, I acknowledge that I'm a guest in the homeland territory of the Tongva. I extend my respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous communities who call these lands home. At LACMA, I'm a curator of contemporary art, and I'm proud to be affiliated with co-presenters GYOPO, an LA-based nonprofit for diasporic Korean artists, curators, writers, and cultural producers seeking to interrogate issues in contemporary art, culture, and social justice, and StopDiscriminAsian, or SDA, a new coalition of art and culture workers confronting racism, xenophobia, and violence toward diasporic Asians, calling out for the solidarity with other marginalized communities to expose and subvert the systemic racism and economic injustice exacerbated by this pandemic. Please check out LACMA, GYOPO's, and SDA's websites and follow them on social media to continue to learn more about the great work they are doing. And for art programs while LACMA is temporarily closed to help stop the spread of COVID-19, please check out LACMA at home. Since news of a novel coronavirus coming out of China broke in January, there have been nearly 2,000 reported hate incidents against Asian American. And we know this number is actually higher due to the underreporting in immigrant and Asian communities. We have seen as many as 100 in a day, with upticks clustered around instances of rhetoric such as the Wuhan virus, Chinese virus, and other finger-pointing and derogatory remarks used by the White House, repeated by national, state, and local leaders, circulated in news outlets, and recirculated on social media, condoning and normalizing hate, putting Asian Americans in danger and at risk. We know that this is a strategy to deflect from the poor management of the pandemic, lives lost, flailing international relations, and an economic downward spiral. From an Asian American family, including a 2-year-old child stabbed at a Sam's Club in Texas, to an Asian American woman taking out her trash in New York, attacked by a man throwing acid on her face, to numerous children being bullied and beaten up in schools before the closures, this violence unfortunately continues and will become more prevalent as we slowly emerge from our shelters. Let's look at the blame and shame game that we saw played out against the LGBTQ community during the AIDS epidemic, on African Americans for peaceful protests, as well as uprisings, including right here in LA 28 years ago, leaving Black and Korean communities divided, and the rise in Islamophobia after 9/11. These are all clear examples of the ways in which damaging messaging, images, narratives, and divisiveness have left people, mostly of color, and from marginalized groups, divided when solidarity is the most productive and equitable way forward. Racism is hardwired into the fabric of this country from its founding, committed to capitalism, colonialism, and slavery. And we cannot stand for the exacerbation of bigotry when the dismantling needs to happen within the upper echelons of the white patriarchy. We must also understand that pitting minorities and marginalized communities against each other in conflict and scapegoating specific groups to deflect blame for national and global problems is part of the project of white supremacy. We see this most clearly in systemic racism, the lack of access to healthcare, education, and professional advancement, the gravely disproportionate death rates in Black, Indigenous, Latinx communities, and here in LA County, Pacific Islander, fully pronounced now, intersections with gender and class, including the makeup of essential workers, and the perpetuation of myths and stereotypes. This moment necessitates greater discourse, self-evaluation, mutual aid, and a recommitment to the broader struggle for equity. Now, I'm going to be candid with you today or tonight or this morning, wherever you are, and I thank you for joining us. I think there are around 2,200 of you who registered for this Zoom panel tonight. You'll notice that all the panelists today are East Asian. And I want to make very clear that this panel, which is titled Addressing Prejudices Against Asian Americans During the COVID-19 Pandemic, is just one in a series of public programs designed to present in-depth discussions around racism, inequity, and injustice in relation to the pandemic. This particular one grew out of an urgency expressed by many East Asian artists and colleagues calling on art institutions and organizations to collectively find ways to expand awareness and address the growing realities of the pandemic. Since February, I myself have been personally assaulted, mocked, and taunted by strangers in public areas simply for being East Asian, possibly Chinese, and in each of these cases, bystanders stood, watched, and then walked away. But please know that we will work with additional colleagues and organizations to unpack the larger picture and problems around racism in the COVID age and address issues impacting marginalized communities, including essential workers and undocumented people. While East Asians are often perceived as white adjacent, we are not a monolith, and we want to reaffirm that racism is always a public health and safety issue, and we must stand together in solidarity for Black lives. We want justice for Ahmaud Arbery. Now, before I introduce our distinguished panelists and moderator, I want to thank my colleagues at GYOPO, LACMA, and SDA for coming together with such vigor, commitment, and support to bring this topic to the world's attention. We still have a lot of work to do, but in the words of Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it is done. Our 5 speakers today are some of the most compelling, outspoken, and well-respected artists, writers, cultural producers, and educators in America. And I'm honored to welcome them to our virtual stage. Each speaker will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. Then we will engage in a discussion with our moderator, Ki-Bum Kim, before we open it up to questions. To ask a brief question, click on the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will do our best to get to as many of the questions as possible. Jeff Chang is Vice President for Narrative Arts and Culture at Race Forward. A national leader in narrative and cultural strategy, Jeff co-founded Culture Strike and Color Lines. His books include Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip Hop Generation, Total Chaos, The Art and Aesthetics of Hip Hop, and Who We Be, A Cultural History of Race in Post-Civil Rights America. Jeff was a USA Ford Fellow in Literature, winner of the Asian American Literary Award, and was recently named to the Frederick Douglass 200 list. The PBS We Gon' Be All Right series is excellent, and I highly recommend it. Our next speaker, Dr. Russell Zhang, is Chair and Professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. Dr. Zhang's research centers on sociology of race, the sociology of religion, and social movements. Dr. Zhang is author of At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Ancestors and Refugee Neighbors, and Family Sacrifices, The Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans. With Chinese Affirmative Action and the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, he helped establish Stop AAPI Hate, a center that tracks anti-Asian discrimination and advocates for targeted policy intervention. And if you have been the victim or are a witness of an AAPI hate crime, please report these incidents at Stop AAPI Hate. Kathy Park Hong is author of the creative nonfiction book, Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning, and what a moving, necessary, and inspiring book this is, and also 3 poetry collections. Hong is a recipient of the Wyndham Campbell Prize, the Guggenheim Fellowship, and the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. Her poems have been published in Poetry, the New York Times, the Paris Review, McSweeney's, and elsewhere. She's the poetry editor of the New Republic and full professor at the Rutgers University Newark MFA program in poetry. Bowen Yang is actor, comedian, podcaster, and writer. Yang co-hosts comedy podcast Las Culturistas and is a featured cast member on SNL. When he was promoted from writing staff to on-air cast in 2019, Yang became SNL's first Chinese American, 3rd openly gay male, and 4th Asian American cast member. And I look forward to his Instagram handle at Faye Dunaway every day. It is a highlight for me. Annika Yi is a contemporary artist whose work fuses multi-sensory experience with synthetic and evolutionary biology to form lush fictional landscapes. Through her research and techno-sensual artistic exploration, Yi is opening new discourse in the realms of cognition, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. Her recent solo exhibitions include the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, New York, Friedrichshain Castle, Germany, Kunsthalle Basel, Switzerland, List Visual Arts Center at MIT, The Kitchen in New York, and the Cleveland Museum of Art. Last year, she created a special edition Sculpture and Fragrance for GYOPO, which is a benefit print available on GYOPO's website. And finally, our moderator, Ki-Bom Kim, to whom I will hand this off in just a moment, is partner at Commonwealth and Council in Koreatown here in LA, and Associate Director, Head of Art Business at Claremont Graduate University. A lawyer and writer interested in the intersections of art, culture, politics, and law, he has published in The New Yorker, The New York Times, and the Los Angeles Review of Books and Foreign Policy. Thank you, and I will see you during the discussion and Q&A portions. Welcome, speakers.
Yeah, thank you, Christine, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. So currently, there are almost 20 million Asians living in the United States, comprising 6.5%, but it is also the fastest growing group. And some interesting facets of the Asian American experience are that it is currently has the highest median earning income, but also has the biggest wealth disparity in the US. So in thinking about tonight's conversation, you know, we want to speak about the racism that is experienced by Asian Americans, both from the historical perspective and what is happening right now during the age of COVID. And some of the things that I want to flag to frame our discussion are issues of explicit versus implicit racism and how Asians have dealt with that and experienced that in this country, and the role that various myths and stereotypes have played to both pigeonhole or silence, but also to cleave Asian American communities, both within and versus other kinds of groups in America. So some of those myths are like the perpetual foreigner stereotype and the model minority myth that many of us are familiar with. So we're gonna start things off with Jeff Chang, who will give us a kind of like a historical overview of Asians in America. And I will have been thinking about a legal scholar, Robert S. Chang, who famous cribbed the quote from Simone de Beauvoir and had said that one is not born an Asian American, one becomes one. Jeff, if you could speak now about the history of Asian Americans.
Sure, and thank you so much, Ki-Bom. Thank you so much to LACMA. Thank you so much to GYOPO, to Stop Discrimination, and to everybody who's been involved in being able to put this together. And thanks so much to all of you who are joining us from all around the world right now. It's a big task to try to summarize Asian American history in less than 10 minutes. So I'm not going to try. And I will point you, though to a series that's going to be on PBS on May 11th and May 12th. Just a little plug here. It's called Asian Americans, and it's going to be able to do a better job than I could ever do in the next few minutes. But I wanted to start here. I wanted to actually start with a Bruce Lee movie, Fists of Fury. There's a scene in Fists of Fury where Bruce Lee actually steps into a karate dojo and takes up a sign that literally says, "The sick man of Asia." And he tears it in half. And this is the moment actually in the Hong Kong cinemas when it first debuted, where people started rioting. They were so happy to see that, because there's a deep history of this stereotype of the sick man of Asia. And it really begins in the 18th century. What happened then was that there were Chinese doctors who were tracing outbreaks of smallpox. And so they did a number of different drawings of folks in order to be able to document this and figure out how to resolve to end the plague of smallpox. These drawings got put together, they were published, and they were actually exported, and they ended up in Europe. And some Europeans would take those photos and look at this and be like, wow, all Chinese are sick, all Chinese are diseased. And in the 19th century, as European powers were thinking about expansion and imperialism, this was literally one of the stereotypes that helped to drive their incursions into China. So that it was a justification for imperialism. this idea of China being diseased, sick, addicted to opium. These are the kinds of things that drove the sort of ideologies of imperialism. And of course, these wars pushed folks to leave Asia. We are all here as Asian Americans because of war. And this is literally what happens in the 19th century. And so you get to the end of the 19th century, and there's a backlash against Chinese immigrants in particular in the US. So that in 1882, all of the animus against Asians, the idea that they're taking away jobs from white laborers, that the idea that they're all sick and diseased, this fuels a push to establish the first immigration law in the US that literally excluded a race, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And yesterday, Kibon reminded us, was actually the anniversary of the signing of that act. This hysteria continues. And so at the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century, there are outbreaks of plague, bubonic plague in Chinatowns. And the way that some folks deal with this is that they burn down Chinatowns at this particular moment, right? So in Honolulu, thousands of people displaced. In Reno, thousands of people displaced. In Los Angeles, where the plague was infecting Mexican Americans at that time, there was the similar type of situation that occurred. And so all of these different types of things are reasons why those of us who hear the term Chinese virus, right, or Wuhan virus, why we feel fear in our hearts, because there's some part of us deep inside our DNA that really holds that trauma that goes over centuries, right, that crosses continents, and that we still hold with us today. And of course, the numbers are there. If we want to go straight to the numbers, we can talk about this a lot more when Russell comes on. Hate violence, of course, has increased because of the usage of this term, the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus. One of the things I wanted to kind of point out here is that, as Kibum pointed out, Asian Americans are in a position where there's huge diversity, and there's massive inequality within the Asian American community itself, right? So on the one hand, you hear right-wing talk show hosts talking about, why are we talking about white privilege? We should be talking about Asian privilege. There's so many rich Asians around me, they really run the world. And at the same time, right, we know, because our families are there, that we are disproportionately represented on the front lines as essential workers, as folks who are working in food industries, service industries, as folks who are working in healthcare, right? And we all know the impact that this is having on our communities on a day-to-day type of basis. I wanted to point out an article that didn't get a lot of play earlier this week, but that has deeply, deeply, profoundly affected me. And it's an article that was on CNN.com that marked that in New York City alone, Asian American employment has gone up 6,900%. Now, you might go 6,900%. That's impossible. But these are the numbers. Last year, this time, there were about 2,000 claims in New York City for unemployment from Asian Americans. This year, there were 147,000. And that's the reality of what we're dealing with. That folks of Asian descent are being displaced from their jobs in huge numbers, in disproportionate numbers. At the same time that we've seen this, we've also seen voluntarism rise dramatically amongst Asian American communities. And so there's all kinds of stuff happening across the country. Mutual aid, folks setting up funds, but also people making masks, making face shields, people coming together to take food to the elderly and to the sick and to the poor. Voluntarism has skyrocketed in the Asian American community. And so I've been reading in some places about the question of hate violence against Asian Americans, and noting that in some places people are saying, well, it's other people of color who are actually preying on us during this particular period. And this is the thing that I want to say. This is the last point that I want to make. We have to have solidarity with other folks of color in this particular period. We know the numbers, that Black and brown communities like us are overwhelmingly on the front lines of this, that they are being struck down left and right by coronavirus, that indigenous people in Navajo Nation are being struck down in disproportionate numbers, right? Our leaders would have us fighting other people of color. But these are the folks who we work with, who are with day by day, who we see their struggles, right? These are the folks who are most affected. And Black and brown people are dying in numbers far out of proportion to their population. And so their leaders will be having us fight each other. But what we know is the only way that we're going to get through the coronavirus is by pushing for equity, right? Science supports this. You don't treat the people who need it the least, right? There's no good reason why Pence and Trump should be getting tested for coronavirus every single day just so they can show up in factories without masks, when thousands of people who are on the front lines can't get tests at the same time. You should be giving these tests to those folks, right? Science supports the equity. We should be treating the people who are impacted the most, right? And equity supports the science. If we are treating the people who are being affected the most, if we are taking care of those populations, then we will be able to get to the end of this virus. And so I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass the mic over back to Kibom and to Russell.
Thank you. And I think, for us that we're involved with Stop Discrimination, this has always been at the very forefront of our minds, how to build solidarity. And some kind of historical context that we've looked towards has been kind of what happened in the 60s and how the Asian Americans who first kind of came up with the term Asian American in the first place around that time and fought for civil rights and various different kinds of rights created for the genesis of ethnic studies and Asian American studies too. And Russell, I'd love for you to speak about that, but if you could also cover how COVID was racialized and some prescriptives for how we can all deal with these incidents of harassment.
Well, thanks, Kiba. I'd like to really call for solid moment. It's a dire time, and now more than ever, we need empathy and cooperation among all groups. And I'd like to thank LACMA and GYOPO and SCA for inviting us today to this important panel. As Jeff said, I teach Asian American studies, and those of us who know Asian American studies know that whenever they're coming from Asia, Asians will get targeted and scapegoated, will face, and then will be excluded, quarantined, detained, and deported. And knowing this, when I heard about the coronavirus, we immediately began to try to document what was going on in order to get government to be accountable. With the organization's Chinese Forefront of Action and Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, we created Stop AAPI Hate in order to document what was going on, but not only to give ourselves a chance to air, but to have a collective voice and then come up with strategic policy interventions. So I just want to share with you some of the thousands of incidents we've already collected. In just a month, we received a lot of harrowing accounts. So here are just a couple of examples. I'm posting on behalf of my dad, a 71-year-old Korean adoptee. He was chased out of a rural convenience store after asking to use a bathroom. Overheard in the public restroom. Thank God no Chinese children were at the soccer practice to infect others. We own and operate a Japanese restaurant. 4 glass windows were vandalized and shattered. We boarded the windows only to be a victim of graffiti the next day. On both days of the incidents, I visually inspected the other businesses on the block. Our restaurant was singled out. My kids were at the park with their dad. an older white man pushed my 7-year-old off her bike and yelled at my husband, "Take your hybrid kids home because they're making everyone sick." Next slide. So again, these are just a fraction of what's going on across the nation and actually around the world. On a daily basis, Asian Americans are facing harassment, purposeful avoidance, getting coughed and spat upon, and even personally attacked. You can see on this chart that verbal harassment and shunning make up the majority of these cases, but these aren't mere microaggressions. When you read the incidents, they're harrowing. Asians getting yelled at, they're having racial slurs and epithets slung at them, and often with elderly and children present. So people are often frozen and stunned when these sort of passing comments come, and it's not until later do they realize, wow, that was a really hateful, hurtful comment. About 10%, if you look at the bottom of the list, are civil rights violations. Asian Americans are facing treatment at the workplace. They're getting barred from establishments and barred from ride shares and transportation. Everybody has the right to accommodations, access to goods and services, but a lot of times now that we're being sheltered in place, when we go to stores where we have most of our confrontations, we're not having that access. We're not having that safety that we're due to. And finally, about 18% of the cases are actually hate crimes, that we're getting physically assaulted. We've read about how people have rocks and bottles thrown at them. They've been hit with sticks, and in a lot of cases, people often spat upon, which is sort of an interesting response to the pandemic. I think people see Asians as being the ones carrying the disease, so they want to reinfect us by coughing on us. That's not only a public health threat, but in the East Coast, one white person was arrested for terrorism for coughing on produce and coughing on a white cashier. And he was arrested for terrorism. So you can make a case that because hundreds of Asians are getting coughed and spat upon today, we're facing mass terrorism. Christine talked about the case in Sam's Club in Texas, where a family from Burma, a refugee family, were stabbed, and a 2-year-old and a 7-year-old were slashed in the head. They weren't Chinese, but the assailant said, "It's because of you people that we have the coronavirus." So again, these cases are pervasive. We've gotten reports from 45 states, and we think it's only going to grow. That the longer we stay sheltered in place, the more the economy tanks. The fact that both parties are making US-China relations a central campaign theme, and as deaths mount because of COVID-19, people are going to get more and more angry. You could see the protests going on now. And when we come out of shelter in place, I'm just fearful that these incidents will again spike, and we'll see a lot more harassment and violence against Asians. So what's causing all this violence? Next slide. It's only a virus, and so why the targeting of Asian Americans? Why the harassment? And I'm going to blame 3 main factors, and once we understand the source of the problem, then we could actually address the problem. As Jeff and Christine talked about it, a lot of it is the political rhetoric of the day that people are, and politicians are especially China bashing in order to deflect blame, to shirk their responsibility for their mishandling of the coronavirus in the US, and to rile up their base. And so Democrats have also responded and began to say they're strong on China. What happens is when politicians continually talk about China in relation to the virus and associate the virus to China, and again, insist on using the term Chinese virus, people make that linkage. They make that assumption, oh, that virus is from China and Chinese people have the virus. And that's what's creating the racial profiling. It becomes an automatic assumption, an implicit bias that the virus is related to Chinese people and Chinese people are related to the virus. Next slide. You know, Jeff talked about Bruce Lee saying China is the sick man of Asia, and here's a Wall Street Journal article right exactly about that. The media then hearing these politicians' xenophobic statements, have to report on it. And the media also circulated hundreds of representations about China being sick and showing people with masks. And so the more people saw articles and stories about coronavirus, the more they saw pictures of Chinese people with masks. So again, we're chemically wired to see the patterns, and that association between China and the virus got cemented. Next slide. Finally, what's new these days is social media, and people are seeing thousands of viral posts and memes, racist taunts and jokes about China and the virus. On the left, you can see a picture of a woman eating a bat. On the right is an Instagram post where the University of Albany students held a coronavirus party. And again, you see the beer, the corona, and you see Chinese people wearing masks. And that, again, creates an implicit bias that when you see a Chinese person, and if they're wearing a mask, then they're going to be diseased and infected. So what happens then is that people begin to racially profile Asians. If Asians are wearing a mask, they're seen as a threat, they're seen as the other, they're seen as being disease carrier. And when people experience threat, they go into flight or fight mode. They either flee Asian Americans and shun them, or they fight Asian Americans and attack us. And that's what's happening. We're not saying that everyone's being racist intentionally, but we are saying that people are acting out of their implicit biases, out of this automatic assumption that the virus and Chinese people are connected. And that's why, we were talking about the words matter. Using the term Chinese virus is stigmatizing and it's dangerous. And that's why it's important for panels like this, when we have cultural workers and artists and writers together, because they're the ones we need to help change the narrative, to change our national discourse. Next slide, please. So if political rhetoric and media representations and social media representations are the source of the problem, what I'm grateful for is that Asian Americans are using politics and media to challenge these representations. As Jeff talked about, throughout history, in Asian American history, we face discrimination because of epidemics, but the other pattern in history is that Asians have always resisted against the racism they face. They always combated their discrimination. And after the Chinese Exclusion Act, we had a mass act of civil disobedience, and over 100,000 Chinese in America refused government directions. Japanese Americans won redress and reparations. Muslims fought back after 9/11 against anti-Muslim Islamophobia and have really garnered a lot more political power. And today we're seeing Asian Americans standing up at this in the same way. I see a lot of our legislators on the national level, and especially in California, stand and trying to denounce anti-Asian rhetoric, calling for a national task force to address anti-Asian bias. And I hope you'll write to your legislators and executive officials as well. Next slide. We're seeing a lot of media campaigns such as Wash the Hate, #activism, that actually, again, flips the switch and changes how people think about the disease. A lot of our celebrities like Jeremy Lin, like Bowen Yang are standing up against this hate, and so we appreciate their strong stands against racism. Next slide. And finally, I think on the community level, like Jeff said, Asian Americans are rallying and organizing and mobilizing on a lot of levels, on the political level, on the media level, and on their communal level. I see churches, I see unions, I see neighborhood groups all coming together. This is a real moment for the Asian American community to come together. We're being racially profiled. 60% of the cases that we're hearing from are not from Chinese, but they're from other Asians, especially East Asians, who are also experiencing the hate. So it's a time where we're coming together as a pan-Asian movement in solidarity with other people of color. So what we did on our level with nonprofits is we created Stop API Hate, and we encourage you to report anything that you've witnessed or experienced, because we need to hear what's going on in order to present to the mainstream media to present to policymakers, this is what's happening in our community. And then once we hear about these reports, we could develop resources for resilience and again, develop strategic policy interventions. This week, we're calling on Governor Newsom at least to establish a statewide strike team to address anti-Asian bias. And we're also, there's also legislation to ask President Trump to do so. Next slide. So I think I'll close there, but, and I have a lot more to say about what's going on and how we're challenging this anti-Asian hate. But like Jeff said, it's a moment for us to come together. And I think this is a time where we don't want to go back to normal, but we want to change and envision a new America and a new international orders where we can actually work in solidarity with others. Thanks.
Thank you. Russell, as you mentioned, cultural and media representations are so important in how we think about and discuss these issues. And in my own conversations with friends, feel like there's been a lot about the experience of race and racism for Asians in this country that hasn't quite been articulated perhaps. And Kathy's book, she actually gave it a name. So Minor Feelings is pointing towards this kind of feeling. And, Kathy, there were so many parts that really cut me deeply in the book. But one part that really I wanted to highlight is when you wrote, "When I hear the phrase Asians are next in line to be white, I replace the word white with disappear. Asians are next in line to disappear." So can you speak a little bit about kind of the minor feelings, how you define that, what kind of prompted you to write the book and what you meant by Asians are next in line to disappear?
Yes, thank you, Kibum. And before I launch into discussion about minor feelings, I wanted to say that I'm really grateful to be here, and thank you, Jeff and Russell, for your amazing presentations. It was very clear and on point. I thought maybe the way to talk about minor feelings is to use a recent example to kind of portray what minor feelings is, and it's a minor example of minor feelings. It's a personal example where I was actually on NPR, and I was in the company of illustrious speakers, George Takei and Erica Lee, who wrote Making of America. And Takei spoke very eloquently in his very kind of rich baritone voice about being in an internment camp when he was a kid. Erica Lee talked about the history of Asians in America and the history of racism. We talked about the rise of anti-Asian racism, the fact that there were almost 1,500 incidents in a month. And then there was a white caller who phoned in, and he talked for what seemed to be like a full 10 minutes. It would seem to be like an extraordinarily long time. And he said, after hearing us talk, or hearing George and Erica talk, that he has Asian friends and they haven't experienced any of this racism. And he just doesn't believe there is anti-Asian racism because he simply hasn't witnessed it himself. It just doesn't exist because he hasn't seen it. Now, I'm not used to radio. I may be the only person who I know who doesn't listen to NPR because I just prefer to read my news. But being on it, I realized how tightly controlled airtime is for live radio. I think I had like 7 minutes to cram my thoughts in. So I was actually quite frustrated by the amount of airtime given to this person who said what we were experiencing wasn't true. George Takei was asked to respond, And he respectfully disagreed, which it impressed me because I was so mad that I wanted to bite his head off, you know? And I was also mad because there was this kind of false equivalence being played out on NPR, which is that we were kind of supposed to act as if this person's opinion had just as much weight as ours. And we were expected to respond calmly and reasonably as if what he was saying was perfectly valid. Now the host moved on, but I asked if I could respond. And yet I was so frustrated that I think I sounded rather strangulated. And afterwards, for, you know, a day, I felt weirdly ashamed that I was being a rude guest because I didn't stick to the script and because I spoke out of turn. So I'm just giving you an example here of what minor feelings is, which is kind of like the kind of emotional, the lingering emotional feelings that you have when your racialized reality is constantly gaslit or dismissed or marginalized by dominant culture. And these emotional affects can include shame, melancholy, anxiety, frustration that continue and that is chronic because from the continual experience, continual feeling that experiences of knowing that what you've experienced is true and unjust, but you're still made to feel as if you're at fault and there is something wrong with you rather than them. When I was writing Minor Feelings, I think before I was writing the Minor Feelings, I had tried to, as a writer, I tried to ignore the Asian American script. And I thought by ignoring it, it would somehow go away. But ignoring it meant tolerating the myth that we are all successful, that we are all rich, that we are all white adjacent. Ignoring it meant that I was tolerating the number of immigrant narratives whose gentle message is that we just want to belong. And I wrote Minor Feelings basically as a manifesto to say that I wasn't going to tolerate these myths any longer. So I bring up the NPR story also to basically talk about the talking point of belonging when we talk about Asian American narratives. And in light of the book that I wrote and also that story, I just want to say that I'm kind of done wasting airtime trying to convince white people that racism against Asians exists. I am done wasting airtime that Asians too are Americans and that we deserve to be here and that we belong. I think that we have given enough examples. Too many of us are scared to leave home. Too many of us have been victim to verbal and physical harassment. Too many of us also know that this iteration of anti-Asian racism is not new, but depressingly familiar. Most of us in childhood or in the recent past have been demeaned or shamed for our identity in some way. A common immigrant experience that I talk about in my book is how it's often seeing your parents also shamed or humiliated and knowing that they cannot protect you. And we're seeing the xenophobia now, as Russell pointed out, with incidents like strangers spitting on a Chinese father and calling him a chink in front of a 7-year-old daughter. It has become all too common again. Now, I was scared the first time I went out with a mask, and now this fear has normalized into a kind of wary vigilance. I am no longer scared, but I make sure not to go out at night, and that when my family does go out for a drive out of town, I make sure not to leave my car when we stop by a convenience store. I take precautions. But I'm not even worried about myself, really. I'm worried about the essential workers. I'm worried about the cashiers in the grocery stores and the delivery men or the manicurists who are now deemed essential and forced back to work in certain parts of this nation. I'm scared for those who are too scared to even report. Another recent example is a Vietnamese restaurant owner who said that a woman screamed at her and she said, "Get out of our country." And the Vietnamese woman said, "They hate us and all we do is work all day." I don't know. I don't know how much time that I have. I'm sorry. I just sort of 2 to 4 minutes. I'm just going to quickly wrap here. Going back to belonging, I'm not interested in the project of belonging because I'm not interested in belonging to a failing infrastructure that is this country. The coronavirus, as I wrote in my New York Times article, is like an irradiating light lancing through the cracks of our neoliberal racist system. If we haven't seen it before, we are seeing these cracks growing and deepening. I think we have talked about the history of racism. I think we have talked about the history of anti-Asian racism. We have given enough evidence, a lot of evidence of that happening now. And in my book, I've tried to give a personal account of how this kind of diminishing of the self feels. I'm curious, I want to kind of maybe use this panel as an opportunity to talk about how we can turn our fears into a collective rage, what we can do. And I think, Russell pointed out some organizations and campaigns to do this, but I think we're at a real point. Lori Garrett, who has predicted the pandemic, said, just as we come out of our holes and see what 25% unemployment looks like, we may also see what collective rage looks like. Our fear now must be transformed to a proactive rage that must stop the rollback to a white America and push back against the grotesque widening gap of economic divisions in this division. As we all know, as we all read, African Americans are 3 to 4 times more likely to die of coronavirus than white Americans. Latinos, at least in New York City, are almost twice as likely. 95% are COVID, 90% of African Americans and Latinos are essential workers. 75% of all POC are COVID or essential workers. We're seeing the racial inequities in stark light. And I think what we need to do is talk about how to build channels of cooperation between people of color, because there's still a lot of misunderstanding. A lot of, for instance, the interracial conflict that was cracked open during the LA riots was never healed. It lay dormant, it stayed congealed, and it's coming out again. And I don't think it's enough to say Asians stop being anti-Black, or worse, Asians breeding resentment against Black and brown people because some of them are perpetrators of this violence. Instead, we have to learn to understand each other because we're not hearing each other's stories. I think that's one first step. And I would love to talk more about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. And in reading the book, you write about how watching Richard Pryor kind of like inspired you to write Minor Feelings. So I've been thinking about how comics really transmute the rage that you speak of and pain and trauma into kind of comic material. And Bowen, particularly with your platform on SNL now, you have kind of been thrust into this light where you represent these sorts of markers of identity. I recently saw an interview that you did where someone was asking, is like, oh, how do you think about representing your Asian identity versus how you represent your queer identity? Which to me felt a little funny because I think it's all kind of inextricably linked. So could you speak a bit to how you think about these issues of cultural representation, like what kinds of things in 2020, in the position you're in, feels right to kind of make fun of and satirize, and what is beyond the pale, and how you think about just embodying cultural representation generally?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Kibum. Thank you, LACMA and GYOPO for having us. And to Jeff and Russell and Kathy, thank you for speaking so concisely and emotionally about everything so far. I don't think I'll have, I have the distinction of being like, I think the least educated person on this panel. So I think I will have the least sophisticated things to say, but I first of all, I loved the Richard Pryor essay in Kathy's book too, because she talks about, I think that's the essay where she talks about the shock of recognition being this thing that Black audiences got out of watching Richard Pryor. I think with all of these really distressing stories being shared now, I think as a very multitudinous group of people, we Asian Americans are sort of feeling that now, that shock. But in terms of queerness, yeah, I find it funny too, Kibum, when people sort of try to decouple those or maybe even pit those identities against each other. I think about the ways that queer Asian people, and I speak as a queer Asian man, they chart their journey sort of relative to what coming out of the closet means. And I've kind of gotten a kick out of sort of reconceptualizing the closet as this synecdoche key for a home, both in terms of a domestic space and in terms of a place bound by a national boundary. So when we talk about oh, my homeland, we all kind of know, I think everyone sort of understands in this seminar how sort of being Asian American is to sort of be caught in between worlds, essentially. So not having that sense of belonging. So anyway, the closet being this kind of interesting representative for what home is fun, because I think, I don't know, there's this very Western ideal around a family unit sort of supporting you or not supporting you through that moment of coming out of the closet. Anyway, this is just to say that as Christine mentioned at the top, sort of looking at LGBTQ activists and their response to when they were scapegoated during the AIDS crisis, I feel like there's something to hopefully take away from in the ways that Asians have had to occupy these interstitial spaces for a long time too, and that we've had to sort of be, I don't know, not scrappy, that doesn't feel like the right word, but just the ways that we've had to sort of take advantage of certain opportunities. I feel like in the few times that I've done stand-up, it's always fun to sort of have the spatial arrangement be that people are watching me, strangers are watching just me talk, and I perform a joke in some of my sets where I go, I was just at a Chinese restaurant, the hostess was white, and then I go, that's what we're dealing with. Nobody on the restaurant staff had relatives die in the rape of Nanking, and it gets a very uncomfortable laugh because no one really knows what that event means historically. Like they're not teaching that in high schools. They're not teaching that in AP Euro or whatever. So it's funny to just sort of like force people to just hear that string of words together. Like, wait, what is he talking about? A lot of comedians talk about, oh, that's a joke that's just for me. Like that's a joke that's just for me, and kind of a dog whistle to like the Asian, if there happen to be Asian audience members. I kind of enjoy, I don't know, like diverting some of what I say specifically to an Asian audience sometimes. And I think that's what we all kind of should start doing now. It's to, yeah, because now as a community, we're sort of on the back foot, and we're in a powerless situation. So I think I am really excited to find power wherever we can. And I think there's power in kind of sharing a collective pain and feeling this pain together at the same time, even if it's with people who are Asian but otherwise have nothing in common with you. And of course, this applies to not just East Asians, but South Asians, Southeast Asians. And yeah, I kind of started my on camera tenure at SNL, and in like in the 3 seconds that I've been on that show, there's already been sort of a lot of loaded, tense publicity around it, especially when it comes to verbal abuse or being pitted against other hires, and narratives sort of get formed on your behalf. And I think we just have to sort of take the reins back and sort of kind of rally together. Oh, and Kathy, I'm all over the place, but Kathy ends her book by talking about Yuriko Chiyama, who worked with Malcolm X and just always sort of worked to rally around sort of mutual aid, and sort of groomed the path forward for, I think, Asian Americans as a sort of civil rights unit. So I think she's also just like a kooky lady, Yuri. Look her up. She's said some wild stuff. Okay, anyway, I'm talking into a void. This is so funny. This is so cool. Anyway, she there are examples of this sort of working effectively in the past that I think we should really steep ourselves in. I think it's easy to sort of buy into this sort of vulnerable position that we've been put in by all of Western culture and media and history, telling us that we are invisible or don't exist. I mean, you know, we've had people sort of be boots on the ground for this in some way, shape, or form in the past. So I think it's just about taking the quantum leap to the next level of this. I am so grateful to be here. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And in these times of crises, feel like the sort of facile approach with this administration clearly hasn't done in a very deliberate fashion, but as we have mentioned about prior cases like during the AIDS crisis and during 9/11, it's just sort of like a very commonly played move to just racialize and define some sort of other to target. And you know, this really has been making all of us think a lot about biopolitics and how people try to fit these sorts of ideas into some sort of real or pseudoscience. And Annika, your work has really been this is kind of like what your work is all about. So can you speak about that and how you've sort of like laid this sort of phenomenon in visual language?
Sure. Before I answer your question, Kibam, I just want to thank everybody, GYOPO, StopDiscriminAsian, LACMA, for organizing this event. And it's a tremendous honor to be in the same virtual room yeah, I mean, Bowen's a hard act to follow. Kathy's an even harder act to follow, and Russell and Jeff. So thank you so much. I want to frame my contribution to this conversation in the form of a biopolitical and a material entanglement sort of contribution. And so I guess, I've been asked to talk about my work. So should we start slide 1? Oh no, I think we're going to the kitchen slide. AV team, not this slide, but I think, do we have the kitchen slide, guys? Okay, we don't. That's fine, because we're all about improvisation right now. Anyway, so I did an exhibition in 2015, and it was at the kitchen. I worked with the curator, amazing curator, Lumi Tan, who's in the audience somewhere tonight. Hi, Lumi. And it was inspired by the Ebola virus. So people have been calling me the contagion queen. I don't know why, but that is how they're calling me. And so the exhibition was essentially a kind of forensic site. I wanted to create a forensic site which could align with society's paranoia around contagion and hygiene, both public and private. And then I wanted to align that with the enduring patriarchal fear of feminism and potency of female networks. How do you do that? Well, I created these quarantine tents. Imagine that, 2015, I created these quarantine tents. Thank you for the slide. And so next slide, I guess. I created these sort of, these little ecosystems, and within these ecosystems, I have these kind of, these motorcycle helmets that are rotating and diffuse these scents. And I created 2 scents. One scent was based on material biological data, microbial data that I collected from 100 women from my personal network. And so I created a scent out of that, and then that is diffusing at next slide, please. And that is pumping out of these motorcycle helmets. And then a contrasting counterpoint scent that I created was from an Urs Fischer exhibition at Gagosian Gallery on Madison Avenue. And that smell was this counterpoint to this very pungent, aromatic, feminist aroma. And the Gagosian smell had really no smell, or what I like to call the smell of fear, because you know, I think that when we talk about smell, you know, power is not supposed to have a smell. So when you walk into a bank, when you walk into the White House, you know, you shouldn't smell anything funky or anything really pungent. Power is odorless. So you know, I'm an artist who works with a lot of smell and olfaction. And next slide, please. And so this is a kind of penultimate super bacteria that I tried to create. And I applied all of the 100 female bacteria into a petri dish. And this is a living time-based sculpture that just kept growing. And this was shown at the kitchen in New York City. Next slide, please. So this is kind of what I'm trying to express through this kind of biopolitics of the senses, where I would argue that our senses and our biology, and in a larger sense, science is conditioned socially. You know, and I think that what we're experiencing now in this era of COVID-19 is a very explicit example of this kind of conditioning and this kind of distortion around science and especially language as well. Next slide, please. So this is an exhibition that I did at the Guggenheim in, I don't know why it's titled 2015. Was it 2016 maybe? Okay, so next slide. And so you enter in, you see these gas canisters, and it transmits this odor that I created with a forensic chemist, a perfumer, and another artist. And it's a hybrid smell between, I took sweat samples from Asian American females, and I combined it with carpenter ants. And it's this kind of trans-species, multi-species kind of scent. And the idea is that you were immersed in this smell, and that you could maybe inhabit the sort of like the perception of this kind of trans species hybrid sort of psychology or mentality. Next slide, please. And then you go, next slide, then you go into the main gallery of the Guggenheim. Next slide, and then next slide, and then you have this kind of very kind of very formal museological diorama. But what you're looking at are 220 agar laden tiles that are growing bacteria that I collected from Chinatown and Koreatown in Manhattan. And it's just sort of proliferating, and it's growing. And the sort of what I wanted to sort of try to examine and explore with this work is thinking about racialized spaces. And so one of the things that I wanted to introduce into this conversation that we're having tonight is a term that, next slide please, is a term that a colleague of mine coined, and it's called Atmo-Orientalism. And we're gonna learn a new word tonight, folks. So Atmo-Orientalism. So it was coined by my colleague, Xuan Xu, who is a professor at Concordia University in Canada, Toronto. Any Canadians out there in the audience? Wait, Bowen, you're Canadian, right? So Atmo-Orientalism, it is a multi-pronged term. And what, on the one hand, it indicates that Asiatic subjects are framed in association with atmospheric toxicity. Does that sound familiar with what's going on right now? And perceived as chemical threats to the integrity of white bodies and minds. Oh my, I have to wrap up. Wow, I just am barely getting started. Next slide. And as a discourse, Atmo-Orientalism perpetuates ideas of racial difference that blames the victims of atmospheric or environmental racism. What environmental racism meaning, like the uneven allocation of noxious air. And so that is kind of how I'm grounding. Next slide, please. A lot of, next slide. I mean, can we get to, yeah, next slide. So this is the sort of the facing diorama, which has 10,000 carpenter ants going through, next slide, through this kind of circuit board. And the exhibition is called Life is Chi, which is a reference to this kind of invisibility of Asiatic labor. A lot of the labor that is, next slide, a lot of the labor that is actually making the electronics, our, devices, and, that are working under very noxious, toxic kind of environmental conditions. Next slide. And wow, am I the only person that's like rapidly trying to speak? See, this is why slideshows are not good. Next slide. Anyway, so I'm interested in this conversation around racism. I'm interested in the materiality of racism, and thinking about how that materiality is also really grounded in language. So we're talking in a moment of, COVID-19, about all of these words like pathogenic, immunity, and how, that's my last slide, great. And how it creates this kind of othering, and how it's so weaponized. I mean, first it starts off as the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, but even if you get into the sort of like the more quotidian, or even like, the sort of orthodox language around the science, pathogenic, immunology, it creates this kind of, this division this othering, and it perpetuates this kind of like this foreign agent that is infecting this sort of like the host body, the clean white body, and what have you. And so I just wanted to kind of introduce that thread into this conversation around racism 2020. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think for a lot of us, recognizing that race is a construct, so many of us still like experience race and the fact that based on our physiognomy, people treat us and we navigate the world like embodying these race sex bodies. Obviously, with all these amazing panelists, we should have allotted a lot more time to everyone, but we want to take some questions from the audience now. So one thing that I think has come up already and something that we're all interested in is this issue of intersectionality. And an audience member, Anu Vikram, asks for Jeff, but could be answered by other folks as well. Thank you for acknowledging the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and recognizing that racist violence in the US is always anchored in our slave-owning past and the vicious treatment of African Americans. I've heard sentiments to the effect that whether because Asian American communities can exhibit anti-Black sentiment and mistrust, or because Asian countries' economic relationships to contemporary Africa, that Asian Black solidarity is neither possible or desired. Can you speak to why such allegiances against mutually directed racism are especially important right now and how we can build that trust?
Mm-hmm. And I don't want to be the only person who answers this question, but thank you for the question. I think it's really, really key and important in this particular period. There's so many ways to kind of get into this particular question. And I think that the sort of, how should we call it, the weight of history is balanced towards segregation and separation, right? So as Asians and Pacific Islanders, with the exception of Hawaii, which was colonized, right? We have come here largely as immigrants, as folks and refugees of war. And these wars are shaped by imperialist notions that predate us, that go back generations upon generations, right? That validated slavery, right? And that validated genocide of Native folks. And so for us to be able to come into that type of environment and to be Americanized, whether forcibly in earlier generations or voluntarily now, right, is to come into that racist ideology, that white supremacist ideology. So if we want to talk about it in the big, multi-generational, global philosophical sense, we want to say that if we're about undoing white supremacy and getting to a new world, then we've got to be able to confront our anti-Blackness from the very beginnings, right? We've got to be able to go to the root of that and root it out. Is it not desirable? Certainly not for folks like Trump. It's definitely not desirable, right? For folks who want to be able to continue to maintain monopolies of power, monopolies of capital, just straight monopolies. And so for us, I think it's important for us to be able to make the choice, to be able to figure out where we stand. Do we stand for the freedom of people to be able to harm whoever it is that they choose and accumulate all that they can in this life? Or are we talking about freedom for everyone, right? Which requires for us to think about how we relate to each other in community. Asian Americans, here's the paradox, right? Asian Americans are the least segregated of all racial groups in the US. So what that requires of us is to figure out where we will stand, right? What kind of freedoms we will choose. to defend, to protect, to fight for, to imagine ourselves towards. And so that's where I would start. And I want to step back because I really want to hear what everybody else in this panel has to say.
Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about just how the different races have been instrumentalized and pitted against each other throughout history to sustain white supremacy. So like in Plessy versus Ferguson, which in 1890 something, recognized separate but equal as constitutional law. You know, a lot of people valorized the lone dissent by Justice Harlan, which pointed out the racism behind it and said that all people are equal. But what often does not get mentioned is that he actually makes it a point to go further and said that there is a race so different that they do not get counted in this equality. And that is the Chinese, because they will never assimilate because they are so alien. They will never be Americans. So, and then, you know, there are other kinds, I think the model minority myth in many ways like still is like very much utilized to, you know, the thinking about the affirmative action lawsuits currently that is putting Asian Americans forward to hide the sort of racist sentiment behind it. Russell, maybe this is a good time for you to speak a little bit about the civil rights era and how these different kinds of solidarity was present between Asian and Black communities in the States.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question about, is solidarity desirable or even achievable? And I'd like to go back to what Kathy was talking about, like in terms of belonging. What type of America do we want to belong to, right? And Jeff was alluding to it too. Do we want to belong to a white empire that segregates, that prizes the economy over public health? An empire that mass incarcerates, mass detains, mass deports, mass bans? Or do we want to be part of a community, a beloved community where we actually, like Jeff said, fights for liberation and the freedom for all? And so, you know, people talk about that this Asian Afro solidarity is non-existent, but I've seen it throughout Asian American history. Even in the 19th century, there were a lot of alliances and allegiances and common projects where communities of color worked together. They went on strike together. Mexican and Asian laborers in the sugarcane fields and in the farms in California. We've always worked together. The United Farm Workers, you know, Bowen talked about Yuri Kochiyama working with the Black Panthers. And we just celebrated at San Francisco State the 50th anniversary of the Third Road Liberation Front strike, led by the Black Student Union, where Filipino, Chinese, Japanese student organizations worked together with Latino organizations, American Indian organizations to fight for ethnic studies. So if you take any ethnic studies, you would learn of this history of solidarity, again, to challenge the colonization and the white supremacy that we're existing in. And so today, to bring it back to COVID-19, I think we do have opportunities to build even more strategic alliances. And COVID-19 just not only exacerbated the structural racism we see, I think it just, well, it makes really apparent to most people observing how racist the society is and how racism is used to maintain this particular administration and its power base. And so for me, one of the imperatives of coming out of COVID-19 is to encourage people to organize and to work in cross-racial alliances, especially to overturn this administration, right? I mean, this administration is sort of the source and inciting the anti-Asian racism of COVID-19. And so we just got to throw this administration out as a first step of working on our solidarity.
I think I'll also mention, as a museum curator who's spent a large portion of my career dedicated to supporting, exhibiting, acquiring work by African-American artists, that, you know, many roads for me lead back to James Baldwin. And he says, the history of the American Negro is the history of America. So wherever you are coming from, to participate and being in this country really is also about learning these histories of slavery, of oppression, that there are so many kind of twists and turns and manipulations and rhetoric and many things that we've talked about in this panel that complicate that, confuse that, but to have kind of unpack it, to have clarity that really understanding that history. And when you go deep enough, it doesn't take much, whether it's a conversation around reparations or, looking to the past, the present, or the future, is something that's just so essential to anyone, wherever you do come from, to really know and to understand and to support and be a part of.
Can I say something too? I think what we're seeing with the coronavirus is also just the stark racial divisions that were here, that's been here since the founding of this country. It was always there, but I think it's hyper present right now, which is that right now what's happening with the kind of premature opening of this nation is a slow genocide of Black and brown bodies, which I am sure is part of this administration's plan, this white supremacist administration's plan, but it's multi-pronged, right? So there are, say, the example of Georgia, they know that the people who will be affected the most will be African Americans, and then they're opening it up anyway. Meat packing industries, majority Latinos, yet they're forcing them to work. Meanwhile, there's also this plan to divert billions of dollars from, it's already happened, of COVID-19 intervention by FEMA and the National Guard to building the border wall. And also we have to also remember there's now a temporary ban on granting permanent stay, a ban on granting green cards to immigrants, which if Trump is re-elected, will be permanent. So what we're happening here is like the way that disaster capitalists are using COVID-19 as a cover to roll back regulations and bail out large corporations. COVID-19 is also being used as a cover to turn the clock, to turn America back into a nation pre-1965, when it was 80% white. This is what they're doing, and I think, Stephen Miller has been engineering this, and has been given way too much power for 30-something-year-old geek. But anyway, I think we need to look at the larger picture here. And, we're back to this kind of model where Black bodies don't matter, they're being killed. Latinos' bodies are being exploited or barred from coming in. And we're seeing, and this is the classic racist model of Asian bodies, just being banned from coming into this country, as being seen as foreigners, aliens, not belonging. And we need to somehow figure out how to talk to other POC about this bigger picture. And it's been dispiriting, I will be honest. It's been very dispiriting since to talk to some other POC, like when I tweet something, a common sentiment I hear is, where were you when we were suffering? This is from African Americans. Where were you when we were suffering? And I don't know how to answer that without being defensive. I could say, I've always fought against anti-Blackness. I've always been, tried to be a social justice warrior. Everyone I know is. That's not a good enough answer, obviously. But how to build coalitions and how to puncture that myth that all of us are white adjacent, that all of us are model minorities. because I think it's complicated because we're a complicated race. We're not all model minorities. We're not, I mean, as an example with affirmative action, the majority of us is pro-affirmative action. If you look at like Hawaii, which is majority Asian, we're the most liberal, it's the most liberal state. And yet media is always focused on the minority of Asian Americans who are anti-affirmative action. What do we do? I don't know. I think it's a very tricky moral calculus, you know, the one that's not just about, oh, we need to be less anti-Black. Because there are some of us who are also anti-Black, but we can't, they're not going to be, they also have to be persuaded, you know, rather than being scolded.
So can I jump in, Kathy, just to kind of riff on what you're talking about? I don't have the answers necessarily, but if I think about this kind of evolution and all these things that POCs share, we have colonialism, we have nationalism, and we have globalism. I'd like to ask the panel, like, where do you see post-COVID-19, where do you see all of this evolving past globalism? You know, I mean, obviously none of us are going to be traveling anytime soon. But the reality is that we are still conditioned as humans, you know, to exist through networks and not through these tidy national borders. And so I'm just asking, like, how do you see this sort of evolving in the near future, and personally, or even, you know, on a social global level?
Yeah, you know, we're getting a lot of questions that are asking about these kinds of issues, these difficult questions about building solidarity and coalitions. And a couple of folks are asking, are there concrete examples that we can look towards? And maybe Russell or Jeff, you guys might, Russell, you know, you've written a book about the work that you've done around Oak Park. Is there anything you'd like to say about how to, you know, build these bridges, how to broach these topics and have these conversations?
Yeah, for me, when you talk about solidarity and belonging, you could tell where people want to belong and maybe who they find affinity and fellowship with by where they live. And so I've chosen to live in East Oakland in California in a neighborhood called the Murder Dubs. And that's because I wanted to belong here. I wanted to belong in a community of color that's a working class, low income community that's working for change. And so for the last 30 years, I've been raising my family here. I live with a lot of refugee communities, a lot of Latinx communities, a lot of unauthorized people. And, you know, people, how do you develop strategic solidarity? Well, you just live with them and rub shoulders with them. You eat dinner with them and go to school with them. And so for me, you know, kids in East Oakland, they're not segregated. They don't have all these sort of abstract issues of how do we build solidarity? They're just friends with one another. And then because we're living together, we find common political interests. We have common class-based interests. We have common issues of race and educational equity. So I think the solidarity and belonging question is you put yourself where you want to belong, and then you create the communities where you want to belong. And it sort of goes to Annika's question of who are our networks? And in America now, because we're so networked by virtual ties, by our phones, and the individual is sort of the prime center of your network, and you just make connections with people with you as the center, it becomes hyper individualistic. And communities used to be more ascribed, you know, communities used to be based on your family background or your church or your union. And so that's shifted a lot. And I think since we have more choice to build our communities, we have to decide where we want to belong, if that makes sense for people.
Yeah. And Bowen, sorry to kind of push you, but you, I think, are probably the only millennial, sort of from the younger generation on the panel. How do you approach these conversations? And we have a question from the audience. Can you elaborate a bit more about your analogy about being in the closet, like, and thinking about it as like a home and homeland? Did you mean coming out of the closet entails also politically embracing racialized identity, which may or may not be supported by queer peers?
Yeah, I totally lost that thread as I was saying it earlier on. Okay, so what I meant by the closet being like synecdoche for like the home is was that I feel like when I hear some other queer peers who are not POC say that they came out of the closet, it was great or it was bad. The closet itself sort of kind of stands for some private versus public living out of their queerness, right? And so I feel like Asians by being sort of othered from the outset in this country are sort of multiply marginalized in that sort of same way. It's like it's not just intersectionality. It's not just intersecting at oppression. It's sort of kind of getting struck by the same bolt of lightning twice in some way, where it's like you are sort of cast out, or that these or that like the ways that like Chinatowns were set up in the very beginning were these very homosocial situations where it was just mostly dominated by men because women weren't allowed into the country, Asian women, Chinese women specifically, and so having these men sort of be relegated to doing domestic work like opening up laundromats or what have you has sort of kind of like just the ways that people talk about Asian men being feminized are just very linked, I think, to this idea that queerness as an Asian person is constantly public. And since we're talking about public health, I guess, in the ways that we're sort of being assaulted publicly, I think I talk about the closet in terms of referencing a social matrix where we are constantly having to find some interstitial space, and we constantly have to find we kind of have to play around with these neatly categorically sort of set up distinctions between living life publicly and privately, or being exiled or being at home, or being an insider or an outsider. So that's kind of what I mean by talking about the closet. It's just like Asian queer people don't ever really come out of the closet because it just implies that we sort of have the luxury of privacy in our domestic spaces. So that's kind of what I meant.
And I'd love to just one last question about the intra-Asian AAPI dynamics. There's a question from Shil Tanaka about recent stats out of California show that one of the hardest hit populations are Pacific Islanders. At the same time, during AAPI Heritage Month, we know that Pacific Islanders are often tokenized or erased entirely, playing into already existing imperial power dynamics. As East Asians have become the default voice in the Asia-Pacific diasporic worlds, what is our responsibility to begin to undo these power dynamics? And what does this look like, not just in theory, but in actual practice? Jeff, maybe, do you want to talk about it?
Well, there's so many ways into this particular question as well. I mean, another thing to kind of note, for instance, is that Pacific Islanders are 3 times more, along with Southeast Asians, 3 times more likely to be deported than other groups, ethnic groups, all ethnic groups, not just Asian American groups. And so what's happening there, right? What's actually going on? And the construction of an Asian American identity is an active project. In some ways, it's been a very fraught project. But in some ways, it's been a very illuminating type of project as well. In that we're constantly forced, I think, and to Vaughn's point, right? We're constantly forced because of being in this liminal space, because of being in the in-betweens, to actually think hard about how we constitute ourselves all the time. And so just to be able to name ourselves Asian American and to be able to describe an Asian America and a future for an Asian America, we have to remake that all the time. And we have possibilities of being able to do that literally under the ways that we decide to use that term Asian America, right? So the way that this looks is that we show up for each other, that we step back when we have power, and we share that power. We do all of the things that we demand of the rest of the country and the world for ourselves. We're making the identity that we want to be able to see. We're creating the process that we want to be able to see in the world. I've seen this happen over and over again in Asian and Pacific Islander organizations, right? Where you get to a point, a breaking point, where folks are like, what have you done here? How is it that you've created this banner and talked about being progressive and open, and yet you haven't made any room for Filipinos, you haven't made any room for South Asians, you haven't made any room for Samoans, for Micronesians, you haven't made any room for Native Hawaiians, for indigenous folks. And organizations have a choice at that particular point, right? They can choose to continue the way that they've done, or they can choose to remake themselves and continue to evolve. And I think that that's part of the beauty of folks who are dedicated to this notion, this very notion of an identity, that we always have the power to be able to show up in a new kind of a way. The thing about this at the end of the day is that if you don't show up in that particular battle, like privilege is you showing, you deciding that you're not going to show up, you saying, I'm not going to engage in this. And the progress is made when you show up and you say, I'm going to engage in this and do what's required of me, whatever positionality that you might be coming from.
We could go on all night, but we're already over time, and they have another event. So, thank you so much to the panelists. You make us all so proud. Yeah, please follow what everyone's doing. Jeff at Color Lines, Russell with all the work that you're doing, gathering information with Stop API Hate. Kathy's book, Minor Feelings, Everyone Must Read. And Bowen, every Saturday on SNL, rapping for us. And Annika, her amazing show at the Tate Turbine Hall has been postponed, but in the meantime, she has a TikTok account, so you can check her out there and keep up. And thank you, LACMA. Thank you, GYOPO SDA. Naima, Cello, Connor, Jessen. Thank you, healthcare workers. Thank you, essential workers. And yeah, I think, as Jeff said, everyone, we can show up and build bridges, and we will be get through this together with collective care. Thank you.